these are my friends. Come along with me, see how the story ends.
Welcome back to another episode of Professional Hippies. Today we have a very special guest. And before we even get into that, Dylan, happy birthday, brother. We got a birthday. We got a hippie birthday. Happy hippie birthday, buddy. Today is Dylan's birthday
old
episode.
Classic hippie birthday.
That's right. And we're joined by John Dennis. John, I think it is incredible that you decided to spare some time out of your busy schedule for us. But for our audience, I wanted to share a little bit about who you are, if that's all right, and give them a background on why I think this is going to be a very special episode. So John is a lawyer, activist, and entrepreneur in the psychedelic ecosystem. It's very impressive once you start to see what kind of role John plays with psychedelics and how he's helping. So it truly is a treat to have you on today. He's the executive director of Vital Organ, a psilocybin facilitator training program by Psychedelics Today, the co-host of Eyes on Organ, a podcast from Psychedelics Today. John is a member of the Chacruna Institute's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. He's a member of Psychedelics Bar Association and sits on its Religious Use Committee. John serves, hang in there, on the executive committee of the Oregon State Bar Practice Section on Cannabis and Psychedelics and is a co-chair of its Psychedelics Subcommittee, not to be outdone by being a founding member of the Entheogenic Practitioners Council of Oregon and was the main driver behind the effort to create a community paradigm of psilocybin services under Measure 109. Whew, man, just getting through what you have done and what you're doing is a lot. So thank you for carving out some time again with us today, John. It really is a pleasure. And we were catching up a little bit before the show, but how are you doing, my soul brother? I mean, let's just take it in for a moment. You know, that's you've got a lot going on. And so just want to check in with you and what's fresh. How you doing?
Thanks, Colton and Dylan. It's great. Thanks for having me on your show. It's an honor to be here and be with you today. Yeah, it's been really a lot. It feels like a lot. Been very busy in the last really year and a half, kind of working to try to, do what we can to create the type of a psychedelic future that we want to leave to our children and grandchildren. And so since this is such a fertile, moment in this kind of rollout and in the so-called Renaissance, it's just like the things that we do today, I think many people anticipate that they'll be kind of felt for, years or generations to come still. So it's like, if we can get it right now, then we can avoid having to spend many, many years correcting the mistakes that we make. So that's kind of the hope. And it is at times exhausting work to try to, get it all together and stay centered and stay grounded and do it from a place of centeredness and kind of heart centeredness. And that's been, the volume and maintaining that kind of orientation is, of course, has its own challenges, but overall I'd say I'm doing really well.
Awesome. Yeah. And I mean, in treating this kind of some reverence for the moment where we're at in psychedelic history is something that isn't lost on me. I don't think it's lost on anyone that's kind of in the know, but I think for the uninitiated, there's also a lack of awareness for why we're back at the cusp of having to go through, the rescheduling and the psychedelic trials and, FDA and stuff like that. So can you just give a little bit more texture to what you mean by like treating this as a fertile moment, right? Because it seems like you are doing everything in your capacity to make sure that this is done right. So can you just give a little bit more context to why that is?
Yeah, so I mean, since the Controlled Substances Act was signed and passed into law in 1971, we've been in kind of what I think many refer to as this prohibitionist era, or the era of the war on drugs. And cannabis was kind of the first to go, and now we're dealing with something that is in some ways very different than cannabis, as we're in this renaissance where the research is really pretty and pretty clear that these are really powerful medicines and powerful, materials, powerful plants and mushrooms that society, humanity is really starting to reestablish a relationship with, particularly in the Western culture, really after decades of prohibition. So, as we reevaluate, that decision that was made, really largely for political reasons back in the early 70s, it's just that, this is the kind of time where we decide like how medical is this going to look? Are we going to allow home use? Are we going to allow this in spiritual use? Or does this have to be, exclusively medical? Are we going to allow like artistic and creative use? Are we going to allow so-called recreational or celebratory use? Or is this going to be kind of locked behind paywalls that keep millions of people out, kind of thing. So that's kind of I think the question of the era, at least for those of us who are in the psychedelic space, is how widely available are these going to be, and how, what kind of culture are we going to build, like with the use of these plants and mushrooms.
And so I think that just kind of takes me back to a little bit of general curiosity, unless Dylan, something showing up for you. But I'm just curious, John, what got you into this? Like, to have the background you have, this isn't traditional. This isn't like the path that most attorneys would take, right? So why the left? Like, you know where I'm going with this. How'd you get here?
Yeah. Well, I was really fortunate to grow up as the son of a pastor, of a deeply devout and spiritual person. My father was an ordained minister within the Foursquare denomination, and I just was really exposed to religious experience, religious community at a young age, and was not, of course, touching psychedelics or anything like that, but just kind of being steeped in a spiritual or religious culture, I think was really a profound, childhood. And I feel really fortunate that those seeds were planted and tended to at a really young age for me, just from my home religious community that I no longer identify with on a personal level, really, but to have kind of that type of spiritual or religious orientation really enforced and encouraged, I think, is something that I'm finding as I get older, it just becomes more of a kind of a rare experience. And so I think that kind of was in there that provide, that now with fewer than half of people in the United States self-identifying as having ever had a religious experience in their entire life, that really blows my mind to think of how a person even sees the world or interprets the world without having that type of knowledge or wisdom to help inform their worldviews. So I think there's something really deeply missing from this. And one of the things that really surprised me as I started going around and kind of talking about religious freedom through a kind of psychedelic lens was that a lot of people were really excited about some of the, affordability pieces and some of the equity pieces and cultural sensitivity pieces of what religious freedom means within a psychedelic program. But the thing that they found really strongly off-putting was the fact that we called it religious. And so, I think we're in an era where a lot of people just live with a lot of religious trauma, and they've experienced religious institutions as really being self-serving and not espousing or actually embodying the values that they preach. And so it's just been such an interesting time where, I think the very institutions that have historically promoted, spiritual growth and development have become sort of, at some people, like the exact opposite of that, and are seen with extreme distrust for very good reason, because I think in many, or if not most cases, at least in the United States, they have become very largely self-serving. So there's a piece of it that comes through that where there's, I think that there is this opportunity to kind of breathe new life into religious organizations, into what people like their own kind of religious or spiritual self-relationship or self-identity through these powerful, catalysts that can really occasion really profound experiences and insights. So there's that part of it that's like there and very important to me. And then on the other hand, there's this affordability piece. I grew up in deep poverty and worked for most of my legal career, basically helping tenants stay avoid homelessness through eviction defense work, and grew up very much like on food stamps and Toys for Tots and kind of government benefit programs and things like that, because just we were really, really poor. And so I think if we create this psychedelic ecosystem that requires people to pay thousands of dollars, people like my parents or me growing up won't be able to really receive the benefit of that. And when you're talking about these things of such incredible importance, where people are frequently reporting that their single psilocybin session in these Johns Hopkins studies is among the top 5 most profound things they've experienced in their entire lives. If you're going to think that we're going to create this kind of a whole ecosystem where the only people who can access these life-changing, profound, religious, spiritual, mystical type experiences are people who can afford to drop $1,000 on a one-day or whatever the protocol is, but it really creates this kind of spiritual class system that will not really benefit, I think, humanity as a whole if it just kind of stratifies the rich and poor even further than they already are being kind of stratified. So there's also this real social justice angle in it as well, that the two goals are both really aligned. Is when you think about affordable access and actually the best type of access, I think it's community access. I mean, we can go to a therapist and we can pay somebody $150 to $300 an hour, and there is something that is very beneficial about having professional help, and not to knock that or to demean that. But what a lot of people are missing isn't like feeling, it's really fundamentally a feeling of being seen, being understood, being loved. And, there's some sense of that where, you're going to be able to do that better within a community than you are through a primarily financial transaction with a stranger, basically. And so I think what that has to offer us in the psychedelic world is this opportunity where we could have a community container, a community model that not only provides better services and more efficacious services because they're being provided within the context of a loving or caring community, and takes it out of that.
It's a weird one.
God said, I'll show you religion. I don't know. Well, John, I wanted everything you were kind of laying out, a lot to unpack on that. The first thing that you were talking about, coming from a religious background, I find it interesting that a lot of people I meet that do dive in more, not to just taking psychedelics just for fun, but those that really want to do research on it and want to kind of understand it more. A lot of them I meet do come from a religious background in that same instance, almost for the reason of where the religious that they were learning growing up, things kind of just cap out. You're like, there's obviously more to this, but I'm only being put into this bubble that this is at. And then you come to learn a little bit more down the road that pretty much all of religion is based off of these things that we're doing more research on, but they want to hide that so that they can keep that and hide that secret. And it's interesting that a lot of people that, like I said, that are doing this research come from that background. And then what you're saying too was, well, building that community, just like any other church would or religion would in their community, you're looking to do that specifically. This concept works. It does help communities, but now let's take that into the psychedelic world and make that happen. That is such a good, you're right. They do align very well. And that's awesome that you've connected those two. Whereas a lot of people would push, the religious away. Like, that I don't want that. Like you said, you've moved past it. But a lot of people would push it away and go, no, I'm going to go the psychedelic route, but not realizing that, no, there's a good plan that was working over here. Let's now utilize that with psychedelic research and building the community there. Yeah,
and I think it's, and the problem that I think I'm seeing come up more and more is there is this growing, I like to call it like the psychedelic industrial complex, but there is this growing industry of professionals who stand to make livelihoods and possibly, investment income off of these, profound substances and basically off of the provision of these mystical type experiences. And as that system grows, I haven't ran the numbers in about a year, and I suspect they've changed quite a bit since then. But last January, a year ago, 2021, when I was preparing for a lecture or a presentation, at that point there was, $5 billion of publicly traded companies that do nothing but psychedelics, and none of them were really making money at that point. Like, there's no publicly available access route that would allow these companies, other than like a small number of ketamine clinics, to even have something that they're offering to the public besides big ideas and that kind of thing. And we're already seeing, territorial land grabs where they're trying to patent holding hands and soft furniture and these sorts of things. And there's just a lot of fear that if we don't kind of establish right now at the beginning of this whole thing that psychedelics aren't necessary. I mean, the question is, how much are we going to allow like the vestiges of the war on drugs to really influence or inform our kind of new generation psychedelic policy? And the answer to that should be not at all, or as little as humanly possible, and to actually make this a science-based, objective kind of inquiry as to like what the actual safety risks are, what the actual dangers are. And we don't want to pretend like there's none, because there are some, and people do get hurt, and people have died, and people will continue to get hurt, and probably in some cases to die, as long as these substances are being used, and especially as long as they're being misused or used irresponsibly. We will have these things. And I think there is this kind of sensationalism that I think a lot of people in the psychedelic community are not really being honest about or candid about, in terms of the fact that there are risks, but at the same time, we don't need to exaggerate those and make it out to be like most people are going to have, really horrible consequences from their experiences. I mean, because until recently, I had never met a person in my entire life who had any psychedelic experiences within these really curated environments with professional assistants on hand, and very rarely have I ever heard in my normal life of anybody who's been harmed on account of those factors. So to all of a sudden pretend like these are necessary in every instance and justify charging people thousands of dollars as the only way of accessing these medicines or these sacraments, or however whatever you want to use to describe them, or however a person's taking them, is just kind of complete nonsense. And it's not really very humble to assume that like the route that you propose for your own professional lens is the only route that is valid or safe to use. And I think the data and the anecdotes and all of that really bear that out. But right now we're just seeing so many people wanting to put psychedelics and psychedelic experience behind all of these regulatory walls that really threaten to make them inaccessible to tens of millions of Americans living in poverty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's almost like you kind of have two camps, so to speak. One camp is, I mean, there's probably more camps than that, but I'm seeing this play out a lot with especially what the state of Colorado recently went through, right? Where you have a fractioning even within the communities that are wanting psychedelics to be rescheduled, are wanting them to be legalized. But even then, you're seeing a fraction of that camp say, wait, we want to make sure it's legalized the right, air quotes. For anyone that wants to watch this, you can also tune into Spotify. I forgot to plug that earlier. But you have the camp that is fractioning off, saying, no, we need to make sure this is done the right way. And the counter argument to that is, any way forward is the right way. And then you have the other people that are like, no, let's just get it through. And then you have at what cost? And you got the people that are saying, no, it's a gateway, like if you open this up, yada, yada. So it seems like it's a little bit more than what people are making out to be, as far as the ones that are on the front lines leading the charge, right? You're hearing multiple narratives from what you're talking about there, and I just want to make sure I'm getting that right, as far as, hey, we want to make sure the big pharma isn't influencing this the same way that we've seen that play out already. Is that what I'm kind of hearing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that, amongst people that are kind of at the forefront, I mean, most of us, a growing number of people, like more and more people every day are suddenly like becoming aware that like psychedelics aren't like evil, and they're generally speaking, if done responsibly and with a little bit of education involved and that sort of thing, that they're really not particularly harmful. They can actually be extremely beneficial for a lot of different things. But so as more and more people kind of come on to the pro psychedelic side of things, we're seeing, people bring with that all of their professional biases and their own, kind of worldviews and that. And I think that it's no longer like, it used to be like, are you pro psychedelic or anti-psychedelic, or are you, psychedelically agnostic or something like that. And now within the pro psychedelic camp, there's just so much splintering and just different, kind of viewpoints on how this should happen, that it's almost like that sometimes some folks have been or commenting that some of the most dangerous people, I guess, for the sake of long-term psychedelic, affordable, democratized access, are people that fall within the pro psychedelic camp, but that are trying to create, just such an expensive camp that is like the exclusive route to get there, that they're almost, even though they're like pro psychedelic in word, they're really like anti psychedelic and what the consequences of what they're promoting. And so, there's this long-standing tension that's long, existed between, kind of a vision for where psychedelics should fit into, society, dating back to Huxley and Leary, where, of course, Leary is very populist and says everyone should do them, everyone should have access. And Huxley's saying that, these are really something that, the so-called commoner may not be able to really appreciate, and they shouldn't be able to really access them. So we've got this elitist, populist tension that has long existed within psychedelics, pretty much since psychedelics have entered into like the West. And we see that playing out right now, where there's a very elitist version that wants to put it behind all the strictures and that be the only way. And the question is, like, where does that leave, the long history of people who use these ceremonially, indigenous people who have, millennia of experience doing this. So to say now that the only way to do it is behind these strictures is just sort of nonsense and possibly really dangerous is where I'm really afraid of, that if we put this too quickly into the hands of these medical establishments that we have traditionally put a great amount of faith and trust in, that we could be ultimately preventing it from being accessible to people, just in the same way that medical care is largely inaccessible to a lot of people now.
So when you're talking about that too, right, and I can see that, because really the only people that have at the moment, as more time is put into psychedelics and more information is being put out there, it's almost like the people that do have the time and money to do that are the people, capitalism, they want to make money off of it, right? So it's someone that had the time to go on a retreat, opened up their mind, and now they're like, ooh, I want to get into this, but of course I want to be making money like this other person. But then I feel like there's the other side. I don't know where this is at. You probably know where there's the religious group that uses ayahuasca, that's gotten permission to use ayahuasca, right? And I don't know what they're established and how they're doing it, or if they're making money, or how they're doing it, but that's like the complete other side, right? And so what is it that you're looking, when you're thinking about all this, right? Because I feel like there would be tiers of this, just like anything else. How do you think the gameplay would work out to make it more accessible for those that normally can't pay the money to do that, right? Like, what is it from agricultural standpoint to make these things, to get it to those that can't afford it? What's the distribution market in order to get it to those that can? Is it through the religious group? Catholics, they do, wine and water, wine and crackers to everybody, and that's their form of distribution to bless you, right? And so there's some sort of background in order to make that happen, but they don't have to pay for it besides their tithes. So just wondering what your mindset is to that, in that direction.
Well, I think it's sort of, there's some nuance that goes into this. I kind of, when I think about the ways that people take psychedelics, I really find essentially 4 different paradigms of access that I think is helpful to kind of frame the conversation. And one of those is the medical therapeutic kind of side. Like, there is the, and that should be, I think, a very highly regulated, highly, looked at, very tightly guarded, side of it, because I think those are the harder cases. I think they're the cases that have, more kind of preconditions that might result in, worse outcome or potentially negative outcomes. And so I think for that side, it makes perfect sense that medicine would be medicine, and it would be, highly technical and require a lot of formal education and that sort of thing. There's the kind of religious or ceremonial side. And I consider that to include, in my framing of this, as these look at like paradigms of psychedelic access and not necessarily legal categories. I would fit religious and ceremonial and really community use kind of in a community container. But I think the hallmark there is that it's done really with intent for profound insight and that sort of thing, and a more religious looking kind of model. You have microdosing, which isn't, it's really more about, there's people who do it for like medical type reasons. There's people who do it for creative reasons. And then we have just kind of like the harm reduction model, which I think is recreational. It includes like non-medical wellness stuff, but it's like, you're just trying to, making sure that people aren't getting, harm reduction should go into all the paradigms, but it's like really just like the catch-all for everything else. So within that kind of framing of this, the religious side of it is the one that thankfully will always be the lone holdout, if nothing else. Like if all of this political stuff just goes in a horrible direction, the medical industrial complex will not be able to stop psychedelics from being used in sincere religious settings. And that's clearly established in law and and that's in our traditions, So that those two are, I think, certainly guaranteed to survive in some way or another. But there's danger in assuming that a person should take psychedelics within one of these paradigms where it's not really accurate. So what I mean by that is, if a person is seeking a medical kind of healing type experience, they might not want to do that. They might want to pursue that initially through the medical paradigm instead of through at a fish show or something like that. They might want to really just be careful and intentional with how they approach it, right?
We can vouch for
and
the
similarly,
fish show,
if a person is, not to say there can't be great, benefit that can come from a fish show, but
Shout out Bonnaroo 2019.
But then there's like this, but if somebody's not seeking religious ceremony, like they probably shouldn't have their first experience within a religious context. Like it should probably be in a different setting. So I think there's harm or there's risk in putting people into a use paradigm where they don't really belong. And I think that luckily, we in Oregon and also in Colorado, we have this kind of driven ecosystem that's starting to form. And the hope is that the providers really meet people where they're at, and they don't try to push them into a direction that they don't really want to go, and that the people who are facilitating these sessions really make this client-centered and really help use these as things to help an individual meet an individual goals. And that could look like a lot of different things, but to not necessarily push recreational act, because if I'm a church member, I don't want the recreational guy showing up and just being insincere, either. So, I think giving people options so that it can actually fit into their lives where it belongs, I think is really a part of this, that if we're not careful now, I think we won't have that kind of diversity within the ecosystem to really give people the options so that it can suit their purposes and their goals. And I don't know if that answers your question, Dylan.
I think it did. It explained to the fact of like you're creating tier levels. You're giving them options, right? It shouldn't be just religion. It shouldn't be you need to pay $1,000 to go on a retreat to figure this out. Like we need to just get the options out there so they can figure it out the best way that they want to do it. And there's paths to doing that. Just like anything else that's become legalized. You can go on a cruise and drink a bunch of alcohol, pay $1,000 to do that, or you can go up to your local market and get a six-pack. There's different levels to doing it. Sorry, Colton, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, all good. I think I'm a little bit behind you. So the thing that I was curious about tapping into, John, would be around just the path forward. There seems to be the ideal version of these modalities becoming reality, and then also working in the confines of what is, the old paradigms of folks that are, what was that movie? Weed. Oh, it's escaping me. The cannabis killer, weed thriller, whatever. Anyway, so you have this old paradigm of folks that are freaked out about drugs.
Reefer madness.
Reefer madness. There it is. Nailed it. So you have to kind of work with what you have, right? And I deeply resonate with what you're bringing in around like, hey, how we're setting this up is essentially the playing board that we're playing from. But I'm also kind of voicing a concern of if we're always in this state of squibbling with each other in the psychedelic community of what's the right way, because everyone's going to have an opinion, is that going to create a stalemate? I mean, does that confuse litigators even more? Does that confuse the populace even more versus taking more of a ready, fire, aim approach, which didn't work out so well the last time? So like, how do you balance all this? And especially through a litigation kind of lens that I think you can bring to the table.
Yeah, the litigation side is sort of interesting. We don't, like, Canada's doing great things, not necessarily through litigation, but I mean, they've been really able to make a lot of headway rapidly on their medical side. Like, thank you, Therasil, but like in general, like the role that litigation, I think, plays in this is a couple. One, it safeguards the religious side, and, there's a ton of impact litigation that really is needing to be done because there are, I attended this law symposium about religious freedom generally recently, and it occurred to me how inane, from a scholarly point of view, the question about entheogenic religious freedom is. Like, it's not really controversial. It's not really novel. It's been around for, without a doubt, since, at very least, since the Religious Freedom Restoration Act passed in 1993, really in response to the oppression of Native American church members who wanted to use peyote in religious ceremony. So, we have a pretty clearly entrenched pathway in American jurisprudence that would, not make this not even like a question anymore. And so there still is a little bit of legal gray area around here, but I think we're just seeing soon like a proliferation of lawsuits, really challenging whether the DEA or customs has a right to, to infringe or even take people's sacrament. I mean, there's a case filed right now where, customs is being sued for confiscating sacrament at the border. And I think that there's just, like, right now, the amount of kind of religious activity that's happening versus the number of lawyers who are actively taking these kinds of cases, there's just a huge disconnect there. And I think there's a big opportunity for more and bigger and bolder litigation to really just be more kind of ambitious with really establishing these rights that aren't, I mean, I think they're already established. The court hasn't said specifically like yes to this, but the Supreme Court's already decided in 2006 that UDV, is basically able to drink, ayahuasca. It's an ayahuasca sacrament, and the Ninth Circuit did in 2009 that the Santo Daime Church can drink its daime, which is another, it's what they call ayahuasca. And, and there's just more and more of this kind of litigation that's happening just all the time. And really none of this is controversial, within, if you just read the plain terms of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and even the First Amendment. I mean, there's a kind of a longer analysis there, but I think that's a big part of, I think, where this is going. And on the other side of it, where litigation can really help, we saw a big jury verdict that happened against MAPS pretty recently, where they were ordered to pay, it's like a $4 million verdict, if memory serves me, for kind of botched harm reduction services at a festival. And, what happened was kind of a, long story, but essentially these harm reduction volunteers were held liable for a fatality that happened, obviously horribly tragic, and nobody's okay with that, but essentially making it really risky for people to potentially offer free help for risk that if they offer free help less than competently, allegedly, according to the court, but then they could be held personally liable for, millions of dollars. And so there's some probably room around that. And then the other thing that's going to happen soon in Oregon, which is super interesting to me, is we're going to see a proliferation of lawsuits around, facilitator malpractice, I think, as people, as facilitators behave irresponsibly or ignorantly or even affirmative acts of like intentional abuse, which I think we will unfortunately see some of. But, so I think that really litigators can help, kind of ensure that it's a balanced system where, facilitators aren't just going around causing harm, and that they really take this all seriously. And that's part of what we're teaching in Vital Oregon, the facilitator training program that I'm involved with through Psychedelics Today in Oregon, is, really helping to try to address these areas of common facilitator malpractice to avoid that kind of those lawsuits from happening, because, this is a new area, and we don't really have, standards of care that are really, defined very well within an adult use system. So I think that's going to be another area for just like future legal expansion and evolution.
I never even thought about that. It's like almost like test your drugs, right? Take a test kit, test your drugs. The same thing with as this is becoming new, people are trying to take advantage, like you said, of getting people to spend thousands of dollars where they really don't know what they're talking about. I never even thought about that, of people claiming to be health professionals, and then it turns out they're just scamming people. And you have to be careful of who you're going to talk to. Do you see a lot of that everywhere, or do you see that boom really just happening in Oregon, California, Washington, those types of areas?
That's a great question. In the underground, where there are underground facilitators, all all over the world, right? Like, and especially in the United States, there's proliferation of underground guides, right? And the problem with legal accountability in those areas is that both the client and the facilitator are doing something illegal to get to where they're at and to do what they're doing. So there's strong disincentives for clients to go and report malpractice or abuse, because they'd be confessing to doing something illegal. And so that's a major disincentive for that kind of redress when something bad does happen. So right now it is starting to, we don't have anybody who's licensed, to my knowledge, yet in Oregon, today being February 22nd, 2022. That's a lot of twos. There's like not really anybody who's licensed and operating yet, so we don't really see the market opening quite yet, even though people are applying for licenses. But, I think we will certainly see a lot of that. And the question is, like, what standards of care really should apply within a regulated adult use system, which is, I think everybody agrees it should be lower standards than in a therapeutic or medical system, but it's probably more than a harm reduction, like volunteer organization. So it's somewhere in this middle range that we don't really have totally identified yet. And, and the Oregon Health Authority, when it adopted the rules for facilitator training, they were really trying to do this delicate balancing act between enough training so that people are competent and harm's being avoided, but not so much training that it becomes too expensive, so that it becomes, again, more inaccessible, because facilitators then have to pay more, and then they pass on to their clients, and it becomes an overly professionalized industry. And so the question is, how professional should adult use facilitation that's not medical or therapeutic in nature really be? And that they struck the balance at basically 120 hours plus 40 in a practicum, and they've received, I think, criticism on both sides of it, some saying that's not nearly enough and saying that's too much. The path forward, I think, is really ensuring that with all of these legal reform efforts and policy reform efforts that are springing up all across the country right now. When Measure 109 passed in 2020, it was kind of light years ahead of what anybody really had expected to be possible, outside of a few people who were kind of close to the campaign. And then, here we are 2 years later, Colorado passed something that's way more progressive. And now, in this year alone, I've heard of 12 different states that have, different reform efforts, either on their ballot or gathering signatures or through the legislative process. So, the rate at which this is expanding is sort of crazy. And with that, there's just going to be a lot of things that we learn, hopefully not the hard way, but I think we're being naive if we think that this is going to be like a 100% perfect smooth sailing. So how to, and the other side of that, of course, is that, there's like 22 veterans a day, at least, who commit suicide, and so you have to balance the rate of going quick to get access quick versus, in general, going quick is a recipe for disaster and for making mistakes. So it's kind of like, how, as a society, do we balance those two things? I don't think anybody I mean, reasonable minds can differ, but, I think a lot of people just want to see it happen really, really soon.
And it seems like, too, as well, why do you, trying to figure out the best way to lay this out. I feel like politicians, when they're getting forced by the people to want to start allowing these things more, they think if this is going to be put into place, it needs to be perfect, right? And by what you're saying too as well, this is such a new lane for everybody. There's no way it's going to be perfect. Is there fear to putting these things in place, that with the expectation that it's going to have to evolve over time? Is there fear of that instead, or is there fear that we can't make it perfect, so why make it happen anyways?
Yeah, as previously mentioned, that tension between the pro-psychedelic camp people, who some would make it extremely regulated and some would have it be totally decriminalized. I think that tension is really the center of a lot of this. And to my thinking, before, I mean, really, during the Measure 109 campaign, it was really interesting. Decriminalized nature came out in opposition to 109. And I think there's a lot of people, myself included, who were really upset by that and thought, you're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, how could you, stand in the way when there's so many people suffering right now? And sure, it's not perfect, but why would you let that get in the way of it? And as times rolled on, I've really had to kind of humble myself and realize that, like, they may have been right to oppose it really altogether, because if what this does, by having these really overpriced, highly regulated programs, creates this kind of, industry, right? This industrial complex that's going to be self-serving and self-protective. And, it really has this meaningful chance at, creating, lobbyists, and others who want to continue to have these paywalls, because the more paywalls, I mean, some people love the paywalls. Some people love there being, just extreme financial barriers to access that are out of proportion to, the safety concerns. I mean, some people will make a lot of money off of that. So I think, we just have to be really humble, I guess, about, how much care is needed. And if we're over padding the whole thing to the point where it's just cost prohibitive, then, I think there's a fair argument to made. Thank you, Decrim Nature. We may have done more harm than good by taking us there, as opposed to just starting from the ground up and decriminalizing and not putting it behind all of the strictures.
And it's tough to be able to tell what the future would hold without, taking a shot there, right? So, one of the things that I wanted to leave some space for in our conversation with you today is, Dylan, are you okay if I move the question up to now so that we can potentially unpack it a little bit more?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Cool. So, John, we ask this to everyone that comes on our show, but with you, I'm really curious to see what shows up. What's a question that you wished more people asked you? Or what's a topic that you wished more people would ask you to expand on?
I think in the psychedelic community, one of our, if somebody asked me, what do you think the biggest problem within the psychedelic community is, and not to presume that it's a monolith, because it's very diverse and there's people who disagree vehemently and passionately with each other. So I don't mean to, gloss over like that diversity, but if the biggest problem with that, in my view, is a complete overemphasis on psychedelics. That, psychedelics, I mean, I think there's kind of like two approaches to it that I see. And one is that there's this saying in Zen that when, somebody points to the moon, you don't look at the finger, right? Like, and so I think in some circles, psychedelics are the moon, and in some circles, they're the finger. And I think there's, basically there's like a strong tradition of like, so I sit on this Chacruna, Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. And so I have wondered about, like, what does it mean? What is a sacred plant, right? And what does it mean to protect a sacred plant? And I think there's one view that, like, all plants are sacred, right? And all of life is sacred, and all matter and all people are sacred. And in a view such as that, there are people who work with plants and fungi in ways that really can only be described as sacred, and they grow, they caretake, and it's an active, ongoing relationship. And it's not that this points to the moon. It's like, it's the finger, you know what I mean? And I think that's an extremely valid approach, right? And I think that should be really respected and honored within our culture with people who do that in a sincere way. There's the other camp that says, they're a tool that helps us to get to someplace, and, you can get caught using or get kind of stuck, bypassing the actual growth challenges that you are facing, and psychedelics could then become kind of avoidance mechanism or escape mechanism to avoid, really having to confront the things about you that are giving you or others trouble. And so I think for most people, their relationship with psychedelics is probably not going to be the sacred reciprocity relationship, and that's, in my view, probably pretty unfortunate. But there's a diversity of approaches that I think are all valid and all belong and all deserve to be protected and honored. But I think there's this kind of sensationalism that we have on psychedelics right now that just make it kind of as the proverbial panacea, that once we get there and everybody has access, that the whole world will turn on and all war will end and poverty will end, and that's really, I think, setting ourselves up for a lot of disappointment. And I think it's really naive to think that someone's going to have a profound awakening experience, and without concerted, protracted effort, probably both before and after that they're going to really realize the full potential of benefits of these substances. So I think, as part of a well-balanced diet, of personal growth diet, if you will, psychedelics have a place in that. But I think if you look to those without really doing all of the other work, you're going to really have kind of taken something out of context and really potentially completely lost the opportunity to benefit from it in the ways that you could really stand to benefit. So that contextualizing psychedelics within the broader self-awareness, self-improvement kind of program, I think, is really what's missing. And, I think that we talk about psychedelics because they're flashy and they're trendy and they're exciting right now. But what's missing from that is that they belong in this much bigger container of healing and soul searching and growth work that I think is really needed. And that said, so that's like the cynical view of psychedelics are a small piece of it, a small but very important piece of it. There's the other side of me that thinks, really like what Martin Luther King said in his 67 Riverside sermon, that what we need today really is less, and I'm ad-libbing and paraphrasing here, but it's less a civil rights victory or less of a Supreme Court decision, and really more of a radical revolution of values, where we become less of a thing-oriented society and more of a person-oriented society, in which human rights matter more than property rights. And what Roland Griffiths is talking about right now as he approaches his own mortality, I've been really watching very closely a lot of his interviews and a lot of what he's been saying as he essentially approaches his own death as a person who's been doing this work for, a long time now, since at least 2006, is that, he's saying what we need are these new cultural institutions that will really help people to properly, maximize the benefits, because if we don't do this work in community, we're going to be missing something really critical and crucial from it. So, that King's vision of less of a thing-oriented society, more of a person-oriented society, I think psychedelics could play a role in that if done, maturely and with, and that doesn't mean it has to be like sour-faced all the time or anything like that, but, used responsibly and maturely, I think they could really potentially help transform society in a really positive direction.
That was awesome. I loved every bit of that.
Beautifully said, brother.
That was amazing. John, the thing that comes to mind, John, about you and learning from you this whole conversation, is it like during anybody's session, right? And they have that real, I wish this was available to everybody. How do we do that? And then at the end of their session, they go back to their normal life of being a whatever. But you're like, no, I'm going to lock into that right there. And I'm going to take that and see how we can actually make that happen. And that's fascinating to me. And I've learned so much from this and everything. I love your perspective too of like, we can have this, but what we're forgetting about is all the in between as well.
Yeah, like I think, and that's where the medical religious side, I mean, I think those two will be here regardless of what we do. I mean, I don't think there's any world where medical is not realized within 5 years max. There's really not a world where I see psychedelic religious freedom as not existing, but it's all those people in between that, you know, will either have to be driven into one of these paradigms that they may not be seeking and forced to you know, undergo like weird psychedelic religious, I mean, that could be brainwashy if it's not your thing, you know, or forced to pretend like they have some kind of like debilitating medical problem and you know, kind of play that game and just, you know, fake diagnose it just to get access. And it, you know, yeah, so I think it's like, yeah, thank you for saying that, Dylan. Yeah, it's been
awesome. It's been awesome. Colton, I didn't know if I know you're lagging, Colton. Anything?
No, I think I would double click on a lot of that, or all of that, literally top to bottom. And I think it's a shame that we didn't get to learn a little bit more about you. That's something that I'm wanting more of at the end of this conversation, is potentially a round 2 in the future if your schedule allows for it, because I think there's a lot to be gleaned from your wisdom in this community and this work, but also what has driven you to be so passionate about clearly doing something bigger than yourself. So that we'll make that our time for this episode. But from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming on. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, John.
And the way you show up. So if people want to connect with you more, support your work, what you're doing, or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Colton. I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. I think it's I think my handle is John Dennis Esquire. That's John with no H, just Jon. Dennis ESQ. I'm also same handle at Twitter, and that's probably the best way to find me and stay in touch. And also the Vital Organ program for folks who are interested in learning more about that. We have a landing page. It's vitalpsychedelictraining.com/Oregon, and we're excited to be pursuing HECC licensure through the state right now, a private career school licensure, so we can offer this training here hopefully by spring of next year, or this year, like later this spring.
That's wild.
So,
we'll keep our community updated on that if you'd like. And I can vouch, he's on LinkedIn. That's about it. Tracking you down. When I started seeing you everywhere, I was like, we got to get this man on. But I was like, are you serious? The only place I can find you is LinkedIn. But we got it done, and if everybody else wants to get in touch with you, they can go there too, you know?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just haven't really I'm not trying to sell very much right now or anything like that. So it's like,
yeah, you're not trying to sell the product. You're like, I'm doing the back end work. Like, this is all the professional stuff. There's no fun social media about that. Yeah. You're like, I'm doing the real work that you think should be done.
Man is doing the real work.
Thanks you guys for having me on. It's been
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for coming on, and we'll make sure to list all your connections in there into the bio as well. Share the episode with those that you love, share it with those that you like. If give us a follow John, and we're looking forward to have you on again, John, down the road when we learn a little bit more about you and where things are at. So hope everyone has a good one. Until next time, peace.